communities in setting up their contract agreements with cable companies. And she's widely recognized as one of the premier experts in the field of contract negotiations. She's been presenting at the Alliance for Community Media annual meetings for years and years, and often is involved in the development of their tracks and things that go on. She's literally done licenses across the country. Any outside of the country? All right, there you go. So she's now working in Canada. So anyways, without further ado, this is Sue Plesky. Please welcome her.
Good afternoon. What I want to do, because we have an hour and it's kind of a short amount of time to cover the amount of territory I'd like to cover. So the first thing I want to do is ask you all what questions you bring to this workshop. Because if I can find out what you bring or what you want to take away, I'm going to be able to zero in on because I'm pretty flexible with my presentation. I can go just about any direction you want me to. So, back here.
I have a question in regards, if you have two cable providers in your community, does the other one have to match the percentage? Do they both have to match the percentage? If one's paying 5%, does the other one have to pay 5%?
So your question is does there have to be competitive equity? Because that's the terminology that goes along with this. So, all right, we're definitely going to be covering that as we go. Other questions? So, competitive equity, I'm going to write these down so I don't forget, because sometimes I don't. All right, competitive equity, other ones, other questions, other things you want to take away. Yeah, all right.
What is the best way to tell the town if you currently receive the monies directly from the cable company as a nonprofit, that they shouldn't be handling that instead?
So,
how do you keep it? What's the best way to tell them? What's the reasoning for telling them that they keep it, besides that it's not town money, it's ratepayer money?
all right, so it's, how do you make sure that the local government is complying with law when it comes to using their money? Sort of, kind of, huh? Okay. All right, other things you want to walk away with, and we'll try to answer. Other questions?
How are you handling HD
HD.
negotiations currently?
Okay.
Yeah, and EPG.
HD and EPG, definitely going to be covering that. Okay, this is, yeah, over here. What I learned a couple of months ago when I did this is a lot of people who thought they knew this really had pieces that were missing. So the reason there's a franchise in the first place is because the cable operator is using public property. They are a tenant on public land. And when you have a landlord-tenant relationship, one of the things that goes along with it is paying rent for the use of the right-of-way. So at the foundation, that is why there are franchise agreements in the first place. It is basic operation of public right-of-way. It's landlord-tenant. Franchises, as you know, are not exclusive. Here in Massachusetts, they're typically 10 years, although in other states, we see them different lengths of time, okay? It used to be very, very common to have them 15 years. We've seen 10. Recently I've seen some as short as 5. 5 is kind of like woohoo, because the franchise renewal process under federal law is a 3-year process. You have a 5-year franchise. You're rolling into renewal essentially almost every other year. I want you to look at that last bullet because it's one people don't think about. And in the United States, the average person pays just for cable $91 a month. Okay, doesn't count internet, doesn't count telephone. And that's a conservative number. You take that $90 a month times 12 months times 10 years. If you have 5,000 subscribers, that contract is worth almost $55 million, and that assumes there's no rate increases. And then you add the internet and the telephony on top of it. Start to do the math on this. When you're looking at franchises for communities of $15,000, $20,000, $30,000, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars are what the company is going to generate off having that franchise. Now, as a landlord, local government, landlord, public property, if Starbucks wanted to put a kiosk in a park, Starbucks would pay rent, right? Okay? So what you're doing here is you're and you know how in malls, it's a flat rate plus percentage when you do figure out what rents are? Bottom line, and here's where I'm going. Do not underestimate the value of the franchise to the cable operator and how much money they're going to make. And I'm not saying they shouldn't make money. I'm just saying understand factually what the value of the franchise is to the cable operator. So if you're looking at 5,000 subs, you're probably looking at, in the cable part alone, over a 10-year period, probably close to $100 million. And then you add in the internet, the telephony, and you take that times 2, we're probably 2.5. So now we're getting upwards to $200 to $250 million in a community with 5,000 subs. That is what the company has at stake in getting the franchise renewal. And this is the kind of stuff that when I show this to elected officials, they go, huh? Because they never think of it that way. It's just the cable company, it's just a franchise, we do it every 10 years, ka-chum, ka-chum, ka-chum. All right, so this is, I wanted to sort of build some of this basic stuff before we get into the nuts and bolts of some of the things you can negotiate for. So a lot of you here in the room today are here because you're really interested in things related to media centers and paid access, but renewal is about a lot of other things, okay? And that's one of the things I found sort of interesting when I do work here in Massachusetts. There tends to be less focus on customer service related issues than I find in like a little bit of Minnesota or Washington State or whatever. But customer service issues are giant issues in many communities, and once I start to bring them up, people go, oh, yeah, call the cable company, stare at home for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever. Those are the sorts of things you can actually deal with in franchise renewal. But all too frequently, I find that they kind of get lost in Massachusetts negotiations. I don't know why. Maybe it's just a pattern that things have evolved into. But the bottom line is you just have to recognize renewal is about state-of-the-art systems and the engineering of the plant, which means INETs, which means what I call PEG links, origination points. Okay. It's about customer service. It's about ensuring, obviously, the funding that you all are going to need for your access centers and the channels and HD and EPG. It's about all of those things. But at the end of the day, it's still about marketing this public right. And that comes in the form of franchise fees, it comes in the form of paid channels, the nature of those channels, it comes in the form of paid origination points, it comes in the form of the kind of customer service you can negotiate for, it comes in the form of some of the legalese that ends up in the franchise that deals with what the gentleman over there mentioned, which is the competitive equity. You have two companies, do they have to do exactly the same thing? In answer to your question, no. But they have to do equivalent things. So you may not need, getting into the competitive equity thing for a minute, you may not need a drop from Verizon and a drop from Comcast going into the same school building. Right? You want one. So if Comcast has got the drop already in, then what would be the equivalent value of something else that Verizon would do? See, look at it that way. Okay? And that's when we get into what we call competitive equity. Now, it's interesting, and I want to kind of riff on this a little bit because you mentioned it. I was recently negotiating a franchise one place, and the cable operator wanted language and basically said that if another cable, this was a town with one company, not two. So if another company came to town, and the city negotiated a franchise that the incumbent company thought was better, the incumbent company got to automatically get lower everything that it was doing to what that the franchise said. It was really pretty ridiculous, but we spent probably upwards to 6 months going back and forth on language and competitive equity. Competitive equity is language is very, very important to the cable industry right now. Because there are multiple operators, and particularly here in Massachusetts and many places. In other places, for the first time, the second companies are coming in. And third, CenturyLink, which is now in this part of the country, is now negotiating franchises in Minnesota, they're a full company, okay, and in Washington State. And some of these places are places where there are already two companies. Okay. So these are just, I wanted to kind of paint kind of big picture world of what's going on out there, and competitive equity is one of the things that I know you're interested in. So again, always remember, ready for the use of the public right of way. That's at the end of the day what's being negotiated. This is just a broad sort of Cliff Notes version of what you have to do and what you should be thinking about every year. So it starts 2.5 to 3 years before the franchise renewal and expires. The cable company must submit a letter saying, I want my franchise renewed in that window. And if they don't, they actually lose certain rights, what they call formal rights under federal law. So what I've laid out here is essentially the federal law process. Okay? It calls for having a performance review, and I'm going to get into the nitty-gritty of that in a little bit. It calls for doing public input, what we call community needs assessment. And when you've done those things, you then build a legal case for what you're going to negotiate for. If you don't do those things, then I'm going to again, all the pieces of the needs assessment, all the pieces of the performance review, the cable operator is going to know you're doing it. And you're going to go to the negotiating table with no negotiating tools in the tool belt. You're going to be stuck because the company is going to know, and I understand that. They know the law, they know the way it should be done. Okay? And they're going to know, so they're just going to keep saying no to you. And pretty soon people get sick and tired of hearing no and agree to what the company wants. Meaning that's, and again, I'm not saying they're bad people, it's just that's a negotiation. And you have to be, this community and the meeting center has to be just as smart as the people who are the professional negotiators who are sitting across the table representing the company. And that's where the playing field is really not very level, okay? Because on the one hand, particularly in Massachusetts and with smaller communities where there's states that are still franchising, you got town officials or community people who do a lot of other things, trying to negotiate, sitting across the table from people who are paid full-time to be negotiators. That just sort of isn't a level playing field. Which is why the smarter you all can become about the right way to do this, you're going to be able to contribute greatly to helping your community come out the other end of the renewal process with a better product. A product that's going to be worthy of, your franchise expires in 2018. That means now, it's 2028. This may be the last time you're going to get to negotiate a franchise, given how crazy things are in the telecommunications arena right now. So just remember, 2018, 2028, 2017, 2027. And to not be on a level playing field with the guys who are sitting across the table from you, it's to me, it's plain not fair, okay? But I want to emphasize this because I'm pushing now on why you need to do performance review, why you need to do needs assessment. Once you do those things, you can build a legal case for what you're going to ask for. Building a legal case isn't going into that room with 5 people and figuring out what you want and going to try and negotiate for it. The company's going to know you went in there with 5 people and came out the other end and said, we want these 10 minutes. They're going to know you didn't go. So let's talk a little bit. Well, basically, if you do the informal process, you're going to do needs assessment, you're going to do performance review, you're going to get to a point where everything, you have a public hearing, you're going to get to a point where everything's all done, you then draft a model franchise and you sit down and you negotiate. If you don't get to yes, then you move over to what's called a formal process. And you issue an what's called an RFRP, Request for Renewal Proposal. The only company that can require and respond to the RFRP will be the company that wants the franchise renewal. Okay. But you don't typically do the RFRP until you attempted to reach negotiations through reach agreement through informal negotiations, and then you go to the RFRP. It's where you have to go to the informal process. Now you may ask me, well, Sue, what are the things you have to do in the front end of the formal process? The same thing you have to do in the front end of the informal process. Needs assessment, performance review, public hearings. So the first part under federal law of formal and informal are exactly the same. Where they part is where the only part when you get to the negotiations and you haven't gotten successful outcomes, then you go to the formal process. So does this make sense so far? I don't want to bore you to death, but I just want to make sure everybody's clear on that because I know here in Massachusetts things are not done exactly that way in some places. And but that's the federal law process. I mean, you can do it any way you want, but you're just putting yourself in greater jeopardy because you're not following the federal law standards. Now, let's talk about what's involved in the performance review part. The performance review is about a look to the past. has the company complied with everything that's in its current franchise or license? Because if they haven't, then you need to give them notice, tell them you haven't complied with these things, give them an opportunity to fix it, and if they don't fix it, then it becomes a tool, and you negotiate a tool belt, okay? Because they are breaching an existing contract by not being compliant with something they were supposed to do over the last 10 years. So that's what the performance review is. I was just in a community the other day, and one of the things that was in their franchise was INET. Well, they said, well, you know, like 5 of the INET locations have never worked. We could never make them work. And I said, well, did you tell the company? Oh, yeah, but they never made them work.
Can you explain what that means, INET?
Oh, excuse me. Good. Do that. Anytime I do one of those things, just stop me, okay? Institutional network. Okay, and what an INET is basically typically it's dedicated fiber that's connecting school buildings or public buildings together, so you can originate video, voice, and data from between those locations, as well as if you want to use it as a paid origination point. So that's what an INET is. Because many franchises have INET. The INET is simply fiber that's in, you got a bundle of fiber going down the street. It's going to carry your cable service that goes into the home. It's going to carry your internet. It's going to carry your telephone. And it's going to carry the fiber for the INET. So it's all in the same bundle. It's not like something separate. It's all in the same bundle. Okay. And most of the INETs that are around now are fiber INETs because they were built either 10 or 20 years ago. Usually they put in fiber when they did them. Now, I noticed here in Massachusetts there are a number of communities that have INETs. Okay, but what I found is in some cases the community hasn't been using them, not just because they weren't working, but because somebody thought it was a good idea to get it when they negotiated a franchise at one point, but nobody figured out how to use it once they got it. Now, that can be a problem when you go to negotiations. Now I'm going to dive into some of the idiosyncrasies here. Okay, if you've got something and the company's provided it, but it hasn't been used, you're going to, if you want to keep it, you're going to have to work really hard to justify it, but you might not want it. And in that case, if it's an INET location and the company's got fiber going into a school building, that fiber, you know, it'll tap off a pole out here or a pedestal on the street. Well, the only thing the company can't use for other purposes is the tail that goes into the building. The rest of the fiber, they'd love to have that to use for something else. So by saying, hey, you know, we don't need these 5 INET locations, you're giving them back something, and you need to get something in return. And that's, again, thinking about everything you do from a negotiating perspective. So that becomes another negotiating tool in your negotiating tool. Franchise compliance and franchise fee. Before I get off the compliance review for a second, here's some other things to look at. Company's supposed to have insurance. Most cases they're supposed to file an annual renewal of that insurance with the town or city. Have they done that? Performance bond, $50,000, $200,000 performance bond. They're very important. Has the company updated the performance? Now I know I'm getting into the weeds on stuff you normally don't think about, but you need to think about it. Okay, somebody needs to be looking at this stuff in franchise renewal. Okay, next thing is franchise fee review. Has the company paid the proper amount of franchise fees? Is it 5%? And there you need somebody who can help you, who really is an expert in cable financing. Your city treasurer can't do a franchise fee offer. Well, that's not fair. Occasionally your city treasurer can do a franchise fee offer. Most of the time, you're going to need to have somebody who's a real expert in the field. And these can be many times you will find underpaid franchise fees. And it's not because a cable company necessarily is purposely cheating somebody. It's just because somebody started input data wrong 5 years ago, and that they just kept doing it. And a lot of times in the States we find things like that. Okay. Sometimes it's because there's a difference of opinion on how to interpret language in your franchise. And that language is the definition of gross revenues. Because the definition of gross revenues becomes a real confusing. All right, so you do a technical audit sometimes of these 3, performance review, franchise fee audit, and technical audit. To me, the technical audit is the least important. Hate to tell you that. Company's going to keep that plant running good because if it's not running good, they're not going to keep subscribers. Okay. Now, occasionally we find problems, but the cost factor, if you're working on a limited budget, the cost factor is the technical audit is the most expensive piece of work of most people inside disaster. You're going to have somebody from the outside help you. So there are really good engineering firms who specialize in doing engineering audits of cable plants. So they're out there, and if anybody is interested, I can give you some references after that presentation. So let's get into the needs assessment. So all of this, I forgot one thing, public input. Now, this part is a look to the past. And I know that's probably not something you guys think a lot about, but I have to tell you, from my experience negotiating, if there are non-compliance issues, they become very key tools in negotiating what you're going to get in the franchise. Because essentially they are reasons why the incumbent operator breached a contract. All right? And in some cases, if it's a major thing, the breach could cause them to lose the franchise. They don't want to do that. They want to make that $200 million or whatever we were just talking about. So that's why non-compliance, this performance review piece, really does become important in the renewal process and in the contract negotiations. Okay, needs assessment. Somebody asked me, are needs assessments like necessary or important? They're really, really critical. And these are the things that I suggest people do. Number one, ideally you want to do focus groups. You want to do an online survey, if you can afford it. You want to do a telephone survey. Sometimes what happens is when we do focus groups, we find out that certain people, certain aspects of the community, certain constituencies didn't participate. So that's when you want to go out and reach out and do stakeholder type meetings to reach out and get input from the people in the constituencies who didn't participate. In places we found, for instance, a lot of times it's very difficult to get the Hmong community to participate in this. So you have to know how to approach certain communities, how to approach the elder, whatever it might be, to get the input that you need from the particular constituency that hasn't been represented and participated. Evaluation of your current equipment. Now, the needs assessment workshops and the online survey are aimed at two things. They're aimed at how people want to use media in the future. And this is really, in short, a communications planning process. This becomes the ground for a communications planning process. For those of you who are with community media centers, the data that comes out of this can feed right into your strategic plan. All right, and that's one of the things we found a lot of times now when our firm has done needs assessments for communities in the franchise renewal process. The access centers take that data because they have all kinds of stuff about what kind of programming people want in the future, what would make it easier for them to use an access center. They'll find out why people haven't been doing as much as that. You ask all these sorts of questions. Is the equipment you have now meeting their needs? You get all kinds of fabulous information that feeds right into a strategic planning process. So doing a thorough needs assessment process during a renewal becomes part and party of being able to help you do a reboot on your strategic plan, or actually do a strategic plan that you might not have done, might not have had in the past. Yeah, so this is a real tool that is not just do it for renewal and put it on the shelf. It really can become a very valuable tool. Evaluating your current resources. So the focus groups, the online survey, the telephone survey, we're going to be getting information, some things about past, but we're also going to get a lot of information about what people's visions are for the future using media tools. You notice I didn't say TV. I said media tools, okay? Because you've got to frame it that way. But we also need to know what are the tools we have in place right now. What condition is our equipment in? What do we have available? How much is it being used? Because sometimes what we find is that what we have now is not meeting current needs, let alone future needs. So that's why the evaluation of the current operation becomes a very important part of what you should be thinking about when negotiating for the future. So once you do your needs assessment, your online survey, you do these things, you do a public hearing, you create a record of information, and it's from that record, from those reports, that then you are positioned to develop a model franchise and the key things you want to have of the franchise renewal process. Then you're ready to sit down and negotiate. If you don't do these things before you sit down and negotiate, you don't have any tools in your tool belt, okay? And I can't tell you how many times I've learned that myself over the years, that if this stuff isn't done thoroughly, then I, as a negotiator, it's going to be harder for me to do the kind of deal that the community or the access center wants, because I don't have the information I need to do that. So with that, let's talk about a few things here. What I've done here is given you, EPG and HD are all different things that a lot of people, I know is very interested in. So in 10 of our most recent online surveys, we found that 60% of the people, we asked them if they subscribe to HD or not, and 60% said yes, okay. And another 35% they said they rarely ever watched anything that was not HD. What does that tell us about how the access channel should be? Access channel should be HD. But what you do by asking these kinds of questions that then give you this data is it creates a justification to go to the cable operator and say, we need HD and here is why. Now here's a few places where HD channels are in franchises, and I kind of wanted to lay these out for you. So we've got a lot of Comcast here, just interestingly, Philly, a lot of Minnesota, a lot number in Washington State. You've got RCN in here, Verizon, Time Warner. I'll post this on my website, so y'all you can just download it from there. Cox, not very many Massachusetts ones here, you notice, okay. I think we have one, and there may be more. I keep a running list. I have about 60 or 70 different places with HD right now, and I know it's not complete, so every time I come and do one of these, if somebody comes up to me and say, hey, we got an HD channel, I add them to the list, okay. Yeah?
You know why these have gotten HD and others have not?
In most cases, it's because they did the things I've just been talking about. Okay. They've done the needs assessment, they've done the past performance review, they built a legal case for what they're willing to negotiate for. And you don't have to be a big city to do those things. I just want to point that out. I mean, I'm working for two communities in Washington State right now who have a total of 7,000 subscribers. But those two towns right next to each other decided to negotiate together rather than to try to do it on their own. And so by having neighboring communities who have the same company, and even if the franchises don't expire, exactly at the same time, you can work it out if the towns can agree to work together, the cities can agree to work together to do a joint negotiation. And that way then you can have more resources available to prepare the legal case that the negotiators are going to need. So that's part of the reason why. Most of these negotiations, by the way, didn't get done in 6 months. They probably took 2 to 2.5 years. Because you were doing all these things before you got to the negotiating table. And then when you got to the negotiating table, you got to figure a year. I mean, particularly when you have the negotiating team being a mix of community people and maybe a consultant or an attorney working with them. I mean, the consultant or attorney may be able to be there every day if you wanted to pay him for that, but the community people who are part of the negotiating team, they got full-time jobs, okay? So you've got to figure that you've got to give yourself time to be able to do the negotiations if you're going to have community people on the negotiating team. So let me jump to the next group of slides because they kind of zero in again on, and just jump in if you have any questions. I'm trying to say. Pretty good. EPG. Okay, now here's just some findings. 5 most recent phone surveys we did for different places around the country. 56% of the people said that the most frequently used source of information that they use to figure out what they're going to watch was the electronic program guide. And they said that they use the EPG 3 times more than any other source. Well, how did we find that out? Well, we asked questions on the survey that said, how do you determine what you're going to watch? Cable TV guide, and we used a whole bunch of stuff, okay? And so by asking the questions in the right way and in the right sequencing, you begin to develop information like this. So designing the survey instrument that's used on the online survey or the telephone survey or the paper survey you hand out or focus group is really, really important, okay? You've got to do it in a way that gets you the information, gets you information that will be useful at the negotiating table. So, obviously, what does this tell us? We need to be on EPG. There's a lot of others Here are some places that have got, EPG. Now, this, and you're going to see again, different companies. I'll just leave it there for a minute for you. Different parts of the country. Now, one of the things that I hear a lot, and some of you may too, is with regard to EPG, it's technically not possible because there are more access channels. There are multiple access channels on the same channel and we're right neighboring towns, and we can't do that. It can be done. There are 2 or 3 different ways it can be done. In fact, for those of you who are interested in diving a little deeper into this, the Alliance for Community Media, there is a notice of inquiry at NOI going on at the FCC right now about independent programmers and community programming. And one of the things that in the ACM, Alliance for Community Media and Alliance for Communications and Democracy filed was a letter. Now, the letter was from this gentleman who's on the Framingham Cable Advisory. His name is, last name is Axel. Glenn Axelrod, I think? Is it, I think you? Glenn, tell them. You tell them what you told me you wrote. The guy who wrote it, you can tell them better than I can.
No, I told Mike that I would do a presentation this summer because in some detail. I'm a technical person. I've worked in the industry for 18 years, and I'm familiar with a lot of the details of why it can be done. It's just not a question. It's just a matter of will.
He wrote a wonderful letter. It's part of the filing, all right? My point is, so for so many years, I was a negotiator, and I'm sure you guys have heard the same thing. We can't do it for legal reasons, but technically it's not possible to put the access content on the electronic programming guide because particularly if you've got 5 towns next to each other and all the access channels in each town are all on channel 5, 6, and 7. I'll just make that up, okay? It is possible. Glenn's letter talked about one way. We have another engineering study from a different engineering studies company that said there's another way to do it. Bottom line is, it's possible to get EPG, and EPG becomes extremely important, as is HD, particularly if you have, if you want to be able to, as you know, record programming, put a timer on. Graham's coming to town in 2 weeks, and the play is on now, and it's not going to be replayed, and we want to make sure Graham sees the 4th grade play, okay? And you have to go to work that day, and it's on at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Well, if you don't have the EPG, and you can't put a timer on, you can't record that play at the 4th graders. My point simply is, EPG, just as HD, there's just no rational reason why these access should not be HD, access should not be EPG. It's just something that's happened within the industry. They've just made certain determinations, but what's happening is that wall is breaking down. As you can see by the list of places that have it, okay? But again, you have to build a legal case for it to get it. So some other things, and then I know you guys have got questions about just negotiations in general, and I think that's best just so you guys kind of fire the questions at me. The PEG funding issues. You guys are really lucky in Massachusetts compared to any place else in the country because you have money that's essentially guaranteed. That 5% franchise fee that's set by federal law, you can have a franchise fee up to 5%. You're the only place in the country, in Massachusetts, where that has to be used for community or cable-related purposes. In other states, it gets dumped into the general fund, and it's rare that a community access operation gets into it. The money that they get to operate is going to come over and above that 5% franchise fee. So you guys are pretty darn blessed on the one hand. Now I know you have some issues. People have been telling me about it on this enterprise fund stuff, etc. But my other point is, there's no reason why you're not. Every community in Massachusetts is not yet collecting 5%. I don't understand. I mean, I understand what's going on here. I don't understand how it got started. Every place else, it's just automatic. The companies don't even argue about 5% franchise fee. I can tell you as a negotiator, they just don't, because they know it's federal law sets a 5% ceiling, which, by the way, has been the ceiling since 1984. Okay? And just as a reminder, it can only be cable revenue. It can't be internet or telephone revenue. also just make sure that it's but I see these 4.25% and 4% and 3%, and when we negotiated the Cambridge franchise, it was 5%. Right?
Can you explain why you got 5%? Because we were told that we can't get the full 5 because Comcast and Verizon get to keep like 0.25% for some bizarre reason. Never explained.
Okay, let me explain. It's not, I mean, 5, there really wasn't even, I don't recall, at least it was a few years ago, maybe it's like 3 years ago when we did this, but I don't recall that much argument from Comcast about it. I mean, we got 5%. Now there's a couple things. Number one, the key is 5% of what? And that what is the definition of gross revenues. And the definition of gross revenues can be plain vanilla, or it can be your favorite ice cream. Okay, let's explain that. But here's why. There's a lot of things that legally you can put into what we call the gross revenue basket. Think of a basket. So in the gross revenue basket, you could put in everything the subscriber pays for TV. HBO, all of the premium services, per event kind of big things, all of that. All of the things that you pay, which are called convenience fees. I want an extra copy of my bill because I lost it, you have to pay $5? Those sorts of insufficient fund fees, late fees, all of those kinds of things. They all should go in the gross revenue basket. Home shopping revenues. A percentage of the home shopping revenues that comes back from things that have been purchased by people in your area that come back to the cable company, they go into the gross revenue basket. Ad sales. If in this area, Spotlight reps most of the designated ad agency, which by the way is an affiliate of Comcast. Remember that, so that find it. They sell the ads. So part of the ad, portions of the money that are applicable, and that goes into the general ledger. There's 200,000 subscribers in that general ledger, and the ad sales for those 200 subscribers goes into one pot. And you've got 20,000 subscribers in your community. You do the math, you take the right percentage, it goes into the gross revenue basket. So you have to be very careful about how you define gross revenues. And I find a lot of different definitions all over the place. And then you calculate the 5%. Now, the issue of the DT, what we call the license fees, which is 50 cents a subscriber a month, a year, 50 cents a subscriber a year, that goes back to the local government, and 80 cents to the state, okay? You then subtract those from the 5%. From the gross revenue basket, and then you calculate 5%. So that's what they're getting at. And so that extra, it's just the way you handle the 50 cents and the 80 cents a subscriber a year. Yes, okay.
How do you handle video streaming over the internet in that gross revenue basket?
If it is part, now here's what's interesting. If it is strictly an over-the-top service, it doesn't go in. Okay? If it is part of a managed service bundle that Comcast is now delivering in some places that's over the top, it doesn't go in. And Comcast has agreed to that. They are not arguing about it, by the way. They are providing over-the-top managed service. In other words, you're not buying one thing, you're buying a package, and they're managing that package. They've set that package up. But they have no problem, as it's been expressed to me and in the trades, paying the 5%, that they feel that's a cable service. So as you get into the nitty-gritty of some of this stuff, and I don't want to bore you to death on it, but the definition of gross revenues becomes really important, and how you deal with the license fees at 50 cents and the 80 cents a year, okay? How you handle those is related to whatever the franchise fee becomes really key. So what's here? So with regard to capital money, over and above whatever your license fee is, okay? This is where it becomes pretty important to do that. Remember we talked about the evaluation of your current resources, your equipment, so on and so forth, and then taking a look at what I think is a really good idea is to do that, to take a look and do a 10-year spreadsheet, which lays out what you're replacing when, exactly what you're going to replace it with, if you're going to replace it today. You don't want to be stuck with that particular piece of equipment 5 years from now. but you need to get a number that justifies how much you're asking for. Then you have to figure out how you're going to ask for it. Is it going to be upfront? Is it going to be so much annually? And so that has to do with, and that's really a very personal thing, place by place as to what's going to work the best. But in most cases, you will have a percentage of the franchise fee, or all of it, depending on the community, and you'll have capital money on top of that. MassAccess. Yeah.
Can I ask you a quick question about the percentage of the fee? The new stuff over the top, since Comcast is now currently working just like DirecTV did, with televisions, where there's going to be no more cable box eventually, and now everything is running over internet protocol, why are we not receiving?
Well, there's
and why don't we get them again? Because we used to get them years ago.
Well, number one, you can't get them now because the law changed. In other words, the law was changed and I can't remember, it was 19. So is it the late 90s or the early 2000s? Maybe it's the early 2000s when that happened. I can't remember exactly. But don't mix intranet up with internet protocol. Okay, internet protocol is just a methodology of transmitting the signal, okay, for lack of a more sophisticated engineering definition, okay. Internet is not the method of delivering the signal.
But when everybody disconnects and just goes over internet completely, what happens?
Well, but it's the same wire.
Right, so why are we not getting the money? It's the same
It's,
wire.
well, Lori, sorry, you're not getting the money because Congress changed the law. You
Somebody
can't
has to
get
go.
it, and you can't get it. And until the law changes,
Right.
you're not going to be able to get it. And unfortunately, if all worlds were perfect, you would get a percentage of all three things, video, voice, and data. It might not be 5%, maybe 3%. Okay, but that's not the way the law's written right now. Unfortunately, it actually in many ways would be much simpler for all conservatives that way. Something like that.
Related to the capital, how does the money that an access station has in the bank work into the negotiations? I think there's a fear in my community. I think we have a reasonable amount of money in the bank. It's not like, but I think there's a fear that if you enter into negotiations and there's too much in your bank account, that's going to hurt you. Is that?
I have to tell you, I've seen companies bring that issue up. Well, why are you asking for XYZ? Because you've got, $500,000 sitting in the bank. You need to think about it. I mean, and it kind of depends. A couple of good basic rules of thumb to remember. Number one, from a good fiscal management perspective for a nonprofit organization, you need to have at least a year of complete operational cost set aside. Okay, so that's number one. So if you've got $500,000 sitting in the bank, and your operating costs are $250,000 a year, that is just good fiscal management. You need to have a year of funding set aside. Okay.
For the organization, board designated funds.
Pardon?
Board designated funds. That's how that's classified.
How people classify things, there's different wording you use, so I don't. But that's certainly one way. Yes. But and so now that 500 becomes 250. I'm just working here a little bit. Now, you look at your equipment right now, and you're 3 years out from renewal, or 2 years out, let's say you're 2 years out. And you've got some stuff that could probably run for another couple of years, but it would be nice to replace it. I think about replacing something if you're in a situation. In other words, it's difficult if somebody's got a huge amount of money setting and not being used. Now, let's tell you purely from a negotiator perspective. I mean, I can, if you got way a lot of money, taking that half off, or my little math formula there, for whatever the year of operating costs are, you may want to make some investments, okay? And don't make them wildly and unreasonably. Have them be justified. But somebody asked me this question just like a couple of days ago. They were in a situation. In their case, they actually had $300,000 set aside, but their annual operating budget was $150,000. So suddenly it's $150,000. Now the other thing to think about is this: you may want to invest some of that money in your renewal process to be able to do some of the things that we've talked about here, so that you have a better justification for what you're going to do in the future. And because that money can be used for that purpose. So that's another thing to think about. I mean, it might be a kind of a good investment to get a little bit of help in the renewal process. I'm not saying do something stupid, but I'm saying if you don't have the expertise in hand, you could use some of that extra money you have to bring the expertise to your community. Now, the thing that I find interesting here in Massachusetts is sometimes the towns actually kind of expect the access corporations to do that, because the towns aren't, particularly if the towns are not getting any of the licensed franchise fees. And I kind of think that's a kind of reasonable expectation, as long as the city and the town and the access corporation are looking at this as a partnership, that they're working together toward the same goal. Which is why I think doing some planning up front, planning for renewal before you get to a year out or 2 years out or whatever, is a really good idea. And also looking at partnering, working with neighboring towns if that is at all possible. It's actually worked very, very well in a lot of places. I see it less here in Massachusetts than I see it like in Minnesota, Washington State, a lot of the places in the Midwest. I see a lot more we call joint power authorities, where you have multiple jurisdictions working together, or at least they bind themselves together, you know, with a letter of agreement that they're all going to work together. And that works pretty darn well. I wanted I mentioned my paid links example about the INET, so I want to make sure I don't forget any of this. Channel locations. You want to have language in your franchise that prevents the company from unilaterally changing their channel locations without giving you notice or without getting your approval of the town's code. I've noticed that in some franchises here in Massachusetts, not a lot, but it's something to really think about. And if they get moved, then make sure there's money in there to cover remarketing, replacing all the materials, the stationery, the letterhead, the t-shirts, this personnel time to redo all the station IDs, all that sort of thing. So put a number in the franchise agreement that if the channels, if you can't keep the channels on the same number, that if they do get moved, then there's the X amount of dollars per channel per move, so that there's money to compensate for the extra effort and time that's going to get taken away from something else, all right, in order to deal with the move. So I'm right on top of the 2 o'clock. Other questions? Because I hope I covered most of what you needed to hear, but I'm sure I probably haven't. Questions? Yeah.
Are you bringing in 20 communities? We're sort of getting hints that one of the providers, Verizon, who's the new entrant, may have not built out the entire community as prescribed. I suspect that it may be small streets that are served by underground plant that weren't built out, and or customer service representatives having faulty information in the database. You know, we've gotten sort of anecdotal reports of people being told service is not available at your location, yet like your neighbor has service, and so clearly something is broken down in the. Are you hearing reports of that?
Okay, he basically said there's been some reports that with Verizon, I think in particular, that they have not built out throughout the whole community like they're supposed to, and or that particularly maybe short streets where it takes underground to go in, or customer service representatives are saying we can't serve your home when your next door neighbor has the service. Actually, I haven't, okay? But that, if you hear that sort of thing, then you really do need to follow up with Verizon. But first of all, check the language in the franchise. You got to make sure that they actually are obligated to build out the whole community. You have to determine what the line extension policy is, because that I've seen some recently that had like a 30 homes per mile aerial and 50 homes per mile, 30 homes per mile, 20 homes per mile aerial, and like higher number per mile for underground. So some of times when you hear these things, it's because the line extension language, the franchise build-out language, what's in the franchise agreement. And sometimes so they may not be in violation, but you need to kind of check that out, then contact Verizon. And another thing I would suggest is have the town or maybe the town and the Access Corporation, both in smaller communities, have a form, have it online on the website for the city, have it online for the website for the Access Corporation. If people have customer problems and they're not getting resolved, it allows them to tell somebody. Okay, and sometimes you call City Hall and I don't know, but if you have something written down, then somebody at City Hall, or, it's interesting, because one place that I set up about 10 years ago, we set the Access Corporation up as the franchise administrator. They don't grant the franchise, but they have the responsibility for enforcing the franchise. And that's part of the funding they get. Is it because in a small town, this was a county and 6 very small communities way up in Humboldt County, way up in Northern California. Access Humboldt up there is actually set up as they enforce the franchise agreement and they run the access checks. Why? Because when we did the renewal process, the county and the 6 cities worked together in the first place. And the city managers, the town managers all realized that they, number one, didn't have the expertise to do renewal negotiations, and number 2, didn't have the time to do any enforcement. But so they budgeted for the Access Corporation to hire an executive director who is knowledgeable in the policy as well as in the production of it. Now that's something to think about here in Massachusetts, I think. I think it is a model that might merit some consideration. I don't think anybody's ever done it here in the state. But I can tell you, it makes hiring the executive director really important. It's not just your really good production person. Okay? It is somebody who has to be more of a manager and a policy wonk, okay? And very detailed on it. But I think it's something you might want to think about as you should look at where you're going in the future. So I got to wind up. I passed my appointed time. And if anybody has any questions that I haven't answered, just come on up and I'll try to answer them.